Okay, so this project is following the production of 22 small frames in a few different sizes. I'm not showing all of that, but just some of it. And usually I would work with a table saw and a miter saw in an actual wood shop to produce frames like this. But these are Corona days, I'm stuck at home, so I'm just working with whatever tools I have. So this is actually some frame stock that I had pre-cut. I had a good amount of this to work with, and I'm just cutting it down into more manageable segments. It's also kind of like a good template that I'll use to produce more pieces of frame stock. Unfortunately, I only have enough wood for a few of them, so this will only get me so far, and I'm going to need to cut more frame stock for this operation. For the rest of the frame stock, I made a jig to be used with a router, and for this jig, I screwed in old pieces of frame stock to act as a guide. This is a small piece of frame stock that I'm kind of using as a reference. This piece I had started to cut, and you can see it's a little too thick for the jig. So I need to plane it down just a little bit. I'm using a block plane throughout this project to control that dimension. So that will ultimately be the depth of the frame, and every piece from now on I have to hand plane and check against my jig to make sure it is the right size. If I plane off too much, then that piece is unusable for this project. So I have to keep planing it and keep checking it against the jig. And I'll definitely be using these shavings in some other project, or at the very least composting them. I'm also making notes on all of these work pieces just in case there might be issues or dimensions I need to be aware of later on. Next up, the jig will be attached to an old garden bed outside of my house. This will be my routing station to cut out more frame stock from the pieces that I just planed down. In addition to the jig and the router, I have a few pieces of wood to act as fences and guides, and to make sure that I'm making consistent cuts. Quite a bit of this sawdust falls right back into my garden, and it becomes compost and fertilizes my plants. Going very slowly is really the best way to ensure that every piece of frame stock cut is good. With every pass of the router, I would lower the router blade ever so slightly. Before cutting each piece, I'll mark it with a pencil, and I'll reference two pieces off of each other to make sure they're exactly the same length. I was also using blue tape as a means of reducing tear out. Later on, I determined that this was a waste of time because with a little bit of wood glue and sawdust, I could fill and sand any blemishes that were present. The blade itself was very old and worn and did not yield a consistent cut. Accuracy is really important when making these cuts, so in the end I think the tape kind of just got in the way in terms of me making an accurate measurement, because really I'm using my fingers to kind of feel the wood to make sure the two segments are the same length, because if they're off by any amount, then it won't be a good miter joint. And for joining the frames, we are going to use the frame segments. So here we are taking off the tape. We'll also use wood glue, and it really helps to have a right angle of some sort to serve as a reference. And up next is a belt clamp. That would be my preferred method of joining with wood glue. When making frames that are smaller, I actually prefer not to use any hardware or any nails or anything like that. The wood glue itself is stronger than nails, so they say, and if I do a good job joining the corners, it's going to be really strong, and it's not going to need anything extra. Beyond smaller frames, sometimes I'll use nails or splines in my frames to make them a little more sturdy. Another thing I like to do is add additional glue to the end grains of the frame stock prior to joining them. It usually just takes a few minutes for the glue to soak into the end grain and to dry. And inevitably, we're at the part of the project where I realize I don't have enough frame stock, and I need to go back through all the previous processes to produce more. So here we are again, working with the block plane to reduce the thickness of the frame stock. Each piece of frame stock would take several minutes to route out. Once all the frame stock had been prepared, it was time to take it to the chop saw. It's better to double or triple check something than to have to go back and recut new material later on. I'll also make notes to myself in pencil, which will later sand off. Then the wood glue will work its magic. After joining the frame, then we go back and check for any mistakes or anything we might be able to fix before sanding. This was also time to clean up the insides of the frames, which might affect inserting plexiglass or artwork later on. The corners were definitely important to pay attention to because glue would commonly squeeze out onto the inside of the frame. And even though these stickers would be fairly easy to sand off, I think more residue would be created through the sanding process, so might as well just chisel them off. Some people think poplar is an ugly wood, but I don't know what they're talking about. I think it looks great. I even like the greenish or brownish pieces. If necessary, I like to use a block plane to clean up the base and the back of the frame. This will save time sanding later on. And before giving the frame a final sanding, a little bit of wood filler is in order, which in this case I'm using a little bit of wood glue and a bit of fine sawdust from the same sanding session. I'm kind of mixing the two of them together and rubbing it into the cracks in the corner of the frame or any other blemishes that I'm finding as I inspect each frame before sanding. If you don't have a sanding device, a block of wood and sandpaper works great. And this is also necessary in order to get the harder to reach places on your frame. So the insides of the corners or the edges or places like that. Hand sanding is also very valuable in the sense that it is the much quieter alternative. Using a sanding device is often very loud, and in this process I think it was the loudest part. I really hate sanding, but it's also an important step in regards to the final product. If you don't do a good job sanding and you apply a finish, it's probably not going to look very good. And of course, don't skimp on the corners. And I like to add a little bit of linseed oil for a finish, which it doesn't offer too much protection, but it does offer a little bit. And that is about it. So thanks for watching if you made it this far. And this batch of frames was used in an exhibition with Yusei Abe. And yeah, I think that show went pretty well. Thanks, Yusei.